In this video, we're going to learn about adding criteria to queries where we are grouping. The challenge here is that we have two types of questions that are very similar when they go into Access, but are asking two very different things. Let's look at an example. We might ask, how many students in each major have a GPA of 2.5 or above? So we would expect a list of majors, let's say English, and then the number of students in that major who have a GPA of 2.5 or above. Or we might ask, how many students are in each major for majors with an average GPA of 2.5 or above? In the first question, we're asking about individual students' GPAs. And in the second question, we're asking about the average GPA for an entire major. But you'll notice we're asking really similar things. So we're asking how many students. That means we're going to need a grouping query and then to count something, ideally the ID since that's the primary key. We're asking about each major, so we're going to group by the major. We're asking about the GPA, so we're going to have the GPA and some kind of criteria for the GPA, and in both cases it's the exact same criteria. So both queries will have the same basic structure. We'll have something we're counting, the primary key, we'll have the major, and we'll have the GPA, and underneath the GPA is going to be the criteria greater than or equal to 2.5. Let's do a quick refresher on how grouping works before we look at those two questions again to understand how Access helps us to answer them. So remember, if we have our 10 students and we group by major, and last time we were looking for their average GPA, so each student will get grouped by their major and put in that group, and then for those students in each major, the average GPA will be calculated. Now let's look at the second question, because that's a little bit closer to what we just saw. How many students are in each major for majors with an average GPA of 2.5 or above? The key thing here is that our criteria is about the average GPA, which means it's really asking about the group, not individuals. So the first step, just like before, is to put each student into a group. It will calculate the average GPA of each group, and then it will apply the criteria. Sociology and French have higher GPAs, but history does not, so that goes away. The first question is different. How many students in each major have a GPA of 2.5 or above? That's asking about the individual students. So we do that first. We apply the criteria first, and 5 of the students have a lower GPA. Those go away. The remaining 5 students are put into the groups based on their major, just like they were before. So now sociology has 2 students instead of 4. French has 1 student instead of 2. And you'll notice that history isn't here because that student was already removed. The key difference between the two questions is whether the criteria applies to each individual student like it does here, and then the remaining students are grouped, or whether all the students are grouped, and then the criteria applies to each group. So let's switch to Access and see how to create these queries. In both queries, remember, we have the same fields. We want to group students by their major, have a criteria based on their GPA, and count the students, which means we'll use the primary key. In both queries, we want to click the totals button so our totals row shows up here so we can group by the major, and ID should be count. In addition, for both queries, GPA should be greater than or equal to 2.5. The difference in the queries is what we're going to choose here in the total row. The easiest one is to look at the second question again. How many students are in each major for majors with an average GPA of 2.5 or above? You'll notice that GPA, what our criteria is based on, has a keyword here, average, connected to it. That's telling us, 1, that it's about the group and not about the individual, and 2, average is a word that we remember from that totals dropdown. Let's choose it. So now we're going to have the average GPA and apply a criteria to that. We can run it and we'll see that we have 5 majors here, all of whom have an average GPA of 2.5 or above. And then we've got to count. 4 of them have just 1 student, the other one has 4 students in it. When we go back to our first question, you'll remember that the criteria should now be applied to individual students. We're asking whether each individual student has a GPA of 2.5 or above. And so we want something different than we chose before. And there's a really helpful clue for when you're reading a question based on this. There's no real word attached to GPA. Nothing like average or sum or a word that has a similar meaning like total. There's no word like that talking about the GPA, which is an indication we need to really choose something else from that drop-down. Now, a lot of students are tempted to choose, because we know it's not sum or average, to choose group by here. That's not going to work though. Remember, if we have 2 things that are grouped by, in order to be in the same group, a student would have to have both the same. So we wouldn't just get one list per major. We would have a list of one student in the major with 1 GPA and a second person listed separately with the same major but a different GPA. We don't want that, so we don't want group by. What we're going to do instead is go all the way to the bottom with a where clause. A where means that we want criteria applied to the individual students before we group them. And when we run it, we'll see this exact results. We only have 5 students included in our results, but there was 1 student in biology who had a GPA of 2.5 or above, 1 student in education who had a GPA of 2.5 and above, and so on. You'll notice the animation was actually incorrect. I thought there were 2 students in sociology who had a higher GPA. There was only 1. Rather than fix the animation, I'm going to remind you this is part of why we want Access to do this. Access to count for us, because we can sometimes get that wrong. I saw in my quick scan through just 10 students, I saw a student with a GPA of 2.43. I read that as 2.53, and it's only now when I ran the query, saw that the number didn't match what I had calculated, that I went back and saw that I had made a mistake. Access, if we write the query correctly, is going to always give us the right answer with very little work. If you're still struggling with the difference between these 2 questions or how to answer each of the questions, that's okay, you're not alone. In my opinion, this is the hardest part of Access that we cover and the thing that students struggle with the most. Give yourself some time to practice this and then watch the video again. Hopefully the second time it will make more sense and appear clearer. And make sure that you start your homework assignment with plenty of time to come into office hours and ask questions so that you can understand it better. But here's my quick summary of how to answer the question. Make sure that you choose the appropriate fields. Here we're seeing how many students. That's telling us to count something. We always want to count the primary key. We're saying in each major. That's telling us we need major and we need to group by major. And then we say have a GPA of 2.5 or above, or an average GPA of 2.5 or above. That means we need GPA as a field. We need to add greater than or equal to 2.5 as a criteria. Then our last thing is to choose something under the drop-down for GPA. In the second question, that word average is talking about the GPA, so we're going to choose average. In the first question, there's no word like that. It's asking about individual students instead of the groups, and so we're going to choose where.